What's up, guys? Welcome back. I know it's been a bit since I made these type of vlog videos, but I feel that the current situation that is going on with the Black Lives Matter movement warranted another video. And unlike many other videos, which are mostly clickbait and me being dumb, this one is one that I feel like needs to be addressed with many of the racist, ignorant comments that are flooding through social media. And so, to begin, I just want to start spouting off a few of the empirical evidence that I have. These are all many different sources. I'll post the sources in the link of the video. But it's mostly to counteract the statistic of 13 to 50% that I've commonly been heard to cite of why discrimination isn't happening. To say that people of color, especially black people, make up 13% of the population in America, yet they commit 50% of homicides. Now, many people use that to denote of why there's no discrimination. It is simply the fact that black people are more violent and prone to violence, and that is why there is more of a violent measure taken against them. However, to go against that, I say maybe we should look a little bit deeper and to say, are really 13% of people really committing 50% of all homicides in America? 13% moving 50%. So here's some other percentages if we want to talk about that. 2017 report by Carlos Medeo at the University of Loyola Law School found that white defendants in Wisconsin were 25% more likely than the black counterparts to have criminal charges dropped or reduced in less serious crimes. Another study in San Francisco, African Americans make up only about 6% of San Francisco's population. They accounted for 41% of arrested, 43% of those booked and jailed, and 38% of cases filed by prosecutors between 2008 and 2014. Look at that statistic. You're going to tell me 6% of people account for 40% of all arrests? And then you're going to tell me that that's not part of systematic racism? And I'll continue. In relation to drugs, there was a substantial race difference in criminal justice histories. Blacks were convicted significantly fewer than whites, so 8% of the time to 11% of the time. Blacks were convicted significantly less than whites. But blacks had significantly more sentences resulting in incarceration than whites, 9% to 6%. So while 8% of the total incarcerations for drug arrest were made by blacks and 11% made by whites, only 6% of those whites got incarcerated, while 9% of blacks did. And on top of that, significantly longer sentences of over almost 2 years versus less than a year from blacks to whites. Another study, but when faced with white subject deemed to present a deadly threat, officers use lethal force in just about 28% of cases. Meanwhile, officers fired upon black subjects in 43% of similar situations. Nearly double amount of the time in a very similar situation, cops used lethal force. Getting last a little bit of empirical evidence, just quoting from a police officer in Dallas. He's commenting on a post about a black man being shot. Said, "Just another savage that needs to be exterminated." That is the kind of systematic racism that is going on. If you want more, I have 4 other studies I can read from. In fact, if we want to look at the national average, it is almost a 5-to-1 incarceration between blacks and whites. Another thing that's leading to maybe the homicides of being so high in the black community is a study found that 911 calls fell by 20% in Minnesota over the year and dropped significantly, and the drop was markedly larger in black communities. Over half, 56% of 911 calls were dropped in black communities, which accounted for over 31% of all neighborhoods in that city. And that's just showing over a 6-year span. If a black community is under fire, who are they going to call when they see on the news and the media of cops brutalizing black men? And that is just all the empirical evidence and numbers that I could quote. And I hate using that as evidence, but it seems like as all of the people who want to argue against Black Lives Movements, they just want to point to statistics. My theory on that is because they don't want to see the people. They don't want to see what's actually going on. There's real people every single day discriminated against. Real stories, if people would just stop and listen. But it's much easier to quote a statistic than it is to see the person. And that is just on crime rates. Being a future educator, the statistics margining that, much more concerning. This all started from something called redlining. Back in the early 1900s. If you don't know what redlining is, it's basically for housing loans that those issuing the loans would redline black communities, marking them too high of a risk to give mortgage to. That means predominantly all of the loans would only go to white people, and they would make suburbs. Now, why is that a problem? Something early 1900s that doesn't happen now, that's been outlawed for many decades now. The lasting effects of that is many suburbs are primarily white communities were able to buy houses and able to pay higher taxes because of that, and able to get higher funding for their schools, while black communities were relegated to apartments or rural areas. What the results in is better schooling for white individuals in white communities versus black communities, meaning that they're already at a disadvantage because of schooling. Another statistic shows how important funding can be. A 21.7% increase in per pupil spending throughout all 12 school-age years for children from low-income families is large enough to eliminate the education attainment gap between children from low-income and non-poor families. Results showing that if there was simply an increase in funding in many predominantly poor communities, the education gap would close. Now, this doesn't stop in education. It continues. Another study shows that simply a black-sounding name changes your ratio of callbacks. African American names versus white names. A white name receives 50% more callback for interviews. Again, I can keep going on and on with statistics and facts and many reasons why, and it's just to point out the idea that this is a real issue. It's an issue that I was blind to for many years of my life. It's an issue that I've become very passionate about. It's an issue that should be addressed with all effort of heart from each individual person. This isn't something that can be just pushed under the rug any further. And for many people saying, you had my support until looting happened, you had my support until the riots happened. Take a look back and look at all of history of America. We were founded on rioting and looting. Many people want to quote Martin Luther King as one who was able to peacefully protest. He was still murdered after living his life peacefully protesting. You know what happened after he was killed? Riots and looting. You know what happened after that? Change. LGBTQ members can look at Stonewall. If you're saying violence isn't the way to change, what other way is there? Black communities have been kneeling for decades. They've been putting up with a lot more for centuries. They were enslaved, they were raped, they were whipped, they were killed. Until finally, a war was waged to release slaves. These are real people we're talking about. And real people are affected by it. And as much as you want to say in your white authority that it doesn't exist, it does. And it's time to become educated, it's time to learn, and most importantly, it's time to listen. For so long, the narrative has been the white narrative. History has been written by white people. Every story, every work of literature that I had to read in high school was by a white author. All world history I learned was European-centered history. It is now time to let other voices be heard. And I'm making this video to address many of my white friends who seemingly are against Black Lives Matter or making excuses. At this point in time, there is no time to be on the fence. Simply not being racist is no longer enough. There's a system and a culture in place that needs to be destroyed. And that can only happen if each person is committed to anti-racism. This is a fight and is no longer a passive event. And I say all this out of the love of all of my heart. And I say this not to make anyone hurt or anyone feel guilty, but as a way to show that change does need to happen. And that change happens within each individual person choosing to fight for what is right.